Welcome to Unexpected Points. Kevin Cole here. No Josh Hermsmeyer. Unfortunately, he's not going to have a chance to weigh in on the news. We have some actual news here with the firing, and you'll see the various graphics all over town. One of the funnier graphics that you'll see now is "Fired, Joe Douglas." Brought to you by Adam Schefter, and they need to put sponsorships on these things. Actually, I saw the funniest graphic, or one of the funniest graphics out there, where it was a European club soccer, women's soccer thing, where the graphic was pregnant because she's going to be out for a while, presumably getting ready for and giving birth. Not only did it have pregnant, but it had like market value, 50 million euros. That's how much we're valuing the player at. Even that sounds a little hefty for a women's player, but pregnant. That was the new graphic there. So we got our graphics out there. Joe Douglas, RIP, for those of you who haven't heard. I have some takes on it. I'll go through some stuff on it, as is my shtick generally. Some contrarian stuff, some hedging, some uncertainty will be played into here. Not going to get too certain in either direction on how great or how bad he was. But the big picture, the overarching picture we're going to have here for Joe Douglas is nothing there to say he deserved to stay, especially considering the fact that I believe he's in the last year of a 6-year contract. We don't need a lame duck GM writing out the rest of the season. And there's not, a ton of time. You think there's a decent amount of time, a lot more time in the NFL than there is in the NBA between the end of the season and the draft. But, once we're chugging through the end of the trade deadline, and I don't think the Jets are looking to make more moves. Who knows? You never know. At this point, via trades, making a lot more moves via contracts, renegotiations, extensions, all that sort of stuff that the Jets can be doing at this point in time. We're already kind of got those wheels turning and rolling into free agency / draft evaluation season / what the hell are we going to do in 2025? Presumably with Rodgers coming back in 2025. The move there might be to get rid of him, but I don't know. I'd have to even look into it a little bit more to figure out exactly what I'd want to do there, because not a great hand to be played by whoever comes in. But I will say, I think, the job for someone who's taking it, you can probably survive till the post-Rodgers era. So I don't think the fact that you're being dealt Aaron Rodgers for one season probably is that bad. But and I could be wrong there. Maybe he'll want to keep playing in 2026. He'll be like the Joe Biden of the NFL and just hanging on for dear life going forward. All right, so let's talk. Douglas is out. Was this right? Okay, again, I say it is right. I say pre-Rodgers, it would have been okay to move on for him. And of course, post-Rodgers and with everything that's gone on there, and then just, the proofs in the pudding, the results that we have this season with Rodgers not playing well, the offense not playing well, but the defense now falling apart and everything going to shit generally. The team that people were hoping would compete for the Super Bowl is now essentially locked out of really even being part of the playoff hunt at this point. Of course, at this point in the season, we're not officially closing the books on anyone, even the Jets at 3-8. We have some very, very outside possibility that they'll be rolling all the way through and, can finish 9-8 or something like that in a weak AFC. Maybe even, I don't know, will 8-9 be enough in a weak AFC to get through? I guess there's some possibility of that. Very small possibility of that. But, they don't even have like good underlying metrics on this team. They have a negative 66-point differential right now, negative 38-point differential, which isn't as bad as, equivalent teams of this rank, but it's not as if they've just been unlucky here. They probably have been slightly unlucky, but I don't think it's enough to really turn things around going forward on the season. And if we're going to, pull up the old schedule here, they got the bye week here. They got the Seahawks, Dolphins, Jaguars, Rams, Bills, and then Dolphins again. Dolphins, let's assume Tua's there for both of those games. They're a pretty good team. The Bills, of course, are top 2, 3, maybe top 1 if you're in Buffalo, if you like the Bills a lot. Pretty good team. Seahawks are kind of average-ish, and the Jaguars, presumably, Trevor Lawrence will be back for that game. They'll be okay, and the Rams are okay. So, we don't have a lot of easy wins necessarily on the schedule. Maybe the Jaguars. I'll give you the Jaguars being an easy win, but we don't have a ton of easy wins even left on the schedule at this point for them to turn things around in these final 6 games. So I think it's a good point in time to be turning the page. Reassessing the Douglas era, if you want to call it that. Or just assessing, I guess, now at the end of his tenure, if you want to call it that. I think Joe Douglas represents the difficulty of assessing general managers, and I guess this would float down to scouts and other people who are part of the player selection process when it comes to the draft, when it comes to free agency to some point, the specifics of the player, not the larger macro forces of like positional value and things like that, but the specifics of the player that you're going after. He's a good example of how we can get fooled into thinking there's a good or bad in one direction or another, when the reality is there's just a lot of potential noise. I mean, let's pull up here just to go through, because again, it can get a little confusing sometimes, just to go through like the draft history for the Jets since Joe Douglas has been there. So Douglas's first draft, if I recall correctly, was the 2020 draft, right? Well, let's see. Let me get this right to make sure. I think that was correct. I know people probably tell me in the comments to make sure they know or not, but let's look here. Oh, no, it says 2019. So did he actually make the 2019, though, picks? I think he came in, right? I think he came in like post. Yeah, it was on June 7th of 2019. So he came in after the draft had already been conducted. So 2020 was his first draft here. And if you're going to go by this draft, it's bad. I mean, it's not bad, though, from a macro, like, positional, who you're going after. I mean, a tackle at pick 11, that sounds pretty good. Wide receiver in the second round, that's a good place. You get Denzel Mims there. You got Mekhi Becton in the first round, who I mentioned earlier. A safety in the third round, Ashton Davis, whatever. We're not going to pick too many nits about here. A running back in the fourth round, LaMichael P. Ryan. I mean, personally, I'd wait a little bit longer, but, we can go further. Maybe Breece Hall, the cornerback. That's always annoying to have Bryce Hall, and then you have Bryce and then Breece. So that was always annoying for those two guys. So the point being, as we're looking at this, is I don't think, again, the macro wasn't wrong, but if you're looking just based upon this one draft, you would have said, oh my God, this guy is like the worst talent evaluator in the NFL. Because if we're talking about these players, where Becton, Mims, those first two picks being really the big ones there, right? Davis also in the third round. Let's look at those high value rounds for these types of players here. I mean, not only are we talking about guys who aren't on the team anymore, weren't successful in a way. Well, actually, I guess Davis is still on the team. But at least the first two picks, not on the team anymore. But Davis is not like an all-time really starting a lot of games necessarily for them. But when we talk about the first two picks, Mims and Becton, we're talking about guys who don't even just wash out of the NFL completely, which is pretty strange. I mean, even for a really, really bad first round pick at left tackle, you figure you'd end up somewhere. So it was bottom tier results there. So again, if you're going to judge him based upon just the player selection, I don't think that the positional stuff was that bad, but the player selection, it looked pretty bad. Now, you flip forward a year further, Zach Wilson at number 2. Yeah, bad, but, who was after him? Trey Lance, then Justin Fields, then Mac Jones. People are even questioning Trevor Lawrence as the number 1 pick. So I can't really get on him too badly about that. Elijah Vera Tucker. Now, this is an interesting one because this is like the first clearly obvious fuck up when it comes to the macro points. Now, player, again, this is not about player quality, who you picked, but this was a player who was clearly slated to play guard in the NFL that you traded up for. You gave up multiple picks to go up and get him at 14 overall. That was the first sign of, they kind of thought they were playing a little bit of house money and they were just going forward to make these picks and to push in on building this team around Zach Wilson, and it failed, obviously. Elijah Moore after that. Michael Carter, running back, was okay. He was there. Michael Carter, safety, was actually pretty good when he was there for a little bit. A bunch of other names that are in the later round picks that we don't really need to worry about. So again, you're looking at these first 2 years, you're going to say Elijah Vera Tucker is the one pick who kind of worked out a bit there, a couple of starting seasons there. At the same point in time, did not get the value. You really hampered yourself by attaching so many picks to Vera Tucker. I remember Jets fans very upset at that point in time in being critical of that selection. Then you fast forward the next year, and this is when we start to get into the mode of, oh my God, Joe Douglas is incredible. He's so good at player talent and player evaluation. Never mind the fact that he had all these high-value picks in previous drafts that all went bust, right? Now we're saying, oh, he got the best defensive player in the draft in Sauce Gardner and the best offensive player in Garrett Wilson, defensive, offensive player, rookie of the year players. And then you got Breece Hall later on in the second round, who's pretty awesome as a rookie. And you're looking at that and saying, well, this guy is incredible. Joe Douglas, the GM of the year candidate. But as we said, he just came off of 2 really, really bad years before that. And even when he takes Sauce Gardner at number 4, remember number 3 was Derek Stingley, who was seen as being a top-notch prospect. It was kind of the guy who fell to him that he took there. Garrett Wilson taking there. Maybe he really, really loved Garrett Wilson, but, Drake London and some others went before that. So it was a guy who somewhat fell to him there. Breece Hall trading up, again, the macro factors and the positional value factors, trading up for Breece Hall. It's been a fine player since then, but as we're seeing, for a second-round pick and an early second-round pick, 36 overall early second-round pick, we're only going to move the needle ever so much based upon even hitting at that position in that location in the draft. Only so much you can do. And then we go forward to recent years. I mean, Will McDonald's actually ended up being pretty good, but not a whole lot else there. And then we're kind of, wait and see on the current guys just as part of an overall, shit show that's going on with the Jets. It's a little bit tough to analyze everything else there. So you have that. You have free agency where, some money was spent on a few different players. The Jamal Adams trade away was excellent, getting those picks and everything else for it. Now, I guess you could have made a mistake there, but it kind of seemed like Adams himself wanted to leave more than necessarily the Jets wanted to get rid of him, but who knows at that point. So we get some credit there. And then we have the Aaron Rodgers situation. So we can't blame Douglas fully. Maybe we can't even blame Douglas mostly for the Aaron Rodgers situation. That being said, I think the reality of the situation, if you're going to add value as a general manager, working with an owner who really wants Aaron Rodgers, working with a fan base that really wants Aaron Rodgers, Your value in that situation is to mitigate harm, I would say. And when you think about the Aaron Rodgers trade package, and the leverage that I thought the Jets had leverage in this negotiation. Now, I guess if you're not willing to walk away, you don't have any leverage, right? That's like the classic negotiation is if you can't walk away, then you're going to get screwed. So they couldn't walk away. They couldn't even feign the fact that they could walk away. They ended up, holding out for all that time, waiting until, after basically, right up until we're getting into the draft before finally making the move. After free agency, all this stuff had gone by. After all these quarterbacks had switched teams had picked up quarterback, where in my opinion, that should have been increasing their leverage as teams made alternate plans for what they were going to do at quarterback rather than bidding a ridiculous amount of money with Aaron Rodgers on a ridiculous contract. Now, he did renegotiate that a little bit, push some things into the future, whatever, but still on a bad contract, an old player, hadn't played well the last time he was the previous season. Packers wanted to move on, all those different things together. Still, for this player, you end up giving up a pick swap near the top, a second round pick, conditional picks in the future, 6th round pick, and have to pay this huge contract, right? Luckily for them, the condition wasn't hit, so it didn't move up to a 1st round pick. So I guess they made a little bit of hay there. But again, if the condition doesn't hit, that means it was probably a bad trade. So you could say, we saved ourselves, only after giving up a 2024 2nd round pick rather than a 2024 1st round pick. Well, I mean, that would have been it was enough of a disaster, just the fact that you're getting rid of maybe the last, if not one of the few last prime years from Aaron Rodgers as part of this deal. So that deal was awful. Bad deal. I said so at the time. This is not, Monday morning quarterbacking. This is not looking back, hindsight bias. I said at the time, very bad deal. If anything, I'm probably more positive and willing to say, hey, we just had some bad luck here for the Jets as far as how the results have played out in this last season. Not hitting a very high outcome from Rodgers. I probably look at it a little bit more kindly than some people do now. The same people who, of course, were praising the trade in the moment. You got to make these declarations of good or bad in the moment beforehand. Yeah, any idiot can look back and say, oh, the Jets shouldn't have made that trade. Great. Thanks. Not helping a lot as far as making decisions and learning for the future. But it was bad. I mean, I don't see any way that Joe Douglas mitigated the bad that came from this deal. And then lopping on top of it, of course, bringing in Devontae Adams and throwing good money after bad, as they would say. But at the same point in time, I'm not that against once you're all in on Rodgers. I'm not necessarily that against throwing it out there and trying to get Adams because, they needed to win something. This is where they mortgage themselves as a franchise. But if he's just executing a strategic plan that was not really his buy-in, if you want to give him credit and say, well, it wasn't his buy-in, it was ownership, it was others. If he's just executing that, then what's his value to the franchise? Bring in someone else that can execute that. Wouldn't make any difference. You're just shifting around, the deck chairs on the Titanic at that point, depending upon who your GM is. And there's nothing prior to that made you say, okay, this is really a quality guy, other than the fact that when he hit on Sauce and he hit on Garrett Wilson, at least initially, and at least for the first couple of years, it looked like those are fantastic picks. His whole reputation was based upon that. Now, I believe he came from the Eagles, I want to say, and maybe it worked. Let me look up good old Joey again. I think he was Eagles, right? Yes, he was Eagles vice president of player personnel. He was a scout for 15 years with the Baltimore Ravens. God, these guys, sounds like a painful life. from 2000 to 2014. Director of college scouting for a year, 2015 with the Bears, and then vice president of player personnel from 2016 to 2019 with the Eagles before coming over. So, if he's going to go back into a scouting capacity, sounds good. I think he's just one of these guys. Like he's meant to be a scout. Maybe he does a good job there. I don't know. It's hard to see we don't have access to these guys' full draft boards. We have access to who they ended up taking, but we can't necessarily say that Mekhi Becton was such an awful pick because Tristan Wirfs was still available afterwards. And then we can't necessarily say that Sauce Gardner was such a great pick because Stingley wasn't available at that pick. Or Drake London wasn't available at the Garrett Wilson pick. I don't know. We can't really say. But clearly that's where he honed his craft. And I know this scout-centric model of GMs, sometimes it can work, sometimes it doesn't work. A lot of times it doesn't work. But I think the skill set for being a GM, in the same way a skill set for being a head coach can be very different from being a coordinator, right? Like successful coordinators don't make successful head coaches necessarily. It's basically throwing darts, figuring out. The only thing that you know about successful head coaches, the only thing that has any signal is the fact that they've previously been a successful head coach in the NFL. You get a little bit of a signal there. I wrote an article about that when Sean Payton was hired and why that was probably a good hire. I mentioned Jim Harbaugh in that article as to why he would potentially be a good coaching hire. Now, I also said with less confidence because there's less history with these guys, but I also said that, someone like Frank Reich might be a good hire, or Doug Peterson probably would have looked like he was a good hire according to those things. And hey, you're just skewing the odds in your favor. You're hoping to get, like a home run type of outcome. You're not necessarily going to get 100% success rate with previously successful head coaches, but you're getting a little bit better because at least you have evidence of them doing the job well, not coordinating a defense well, not coordinating an offense well, not coordinating special teams well, not interviewing well, but doing the job well before. When it comes to GMs, very few guys get multiple chances at GMs. A lot of them just implode on the way out as they pile on a bunch of bad contracts and that the new hire has to dig his way out of. I was going to say his or her. We haven't had a her yet. Maybe we will. I think the Eagles actually have a woman who's pretty high up in their organization right now. Or is it the Browns? I can't remember. I think it's the Eagles. So like that, there's a little bit less of placing those guys in those organizations again. But there's little to tell us that a scout has the capacity to be a great GM. This idea of like a super scout as a GM, it's faulty. You have a whole structure of people to do the scouting. What's important with the GM is how you synthesize, how you process that information, how you make decisions, how you try to skew the odds in your favor on all these different ways that you can, like positional value, like trading back, like collecting new and novel data that other people aren't getting and being able to make assessments based upon that. It's doing all of those sorts of things that's going to make the real difference. Dealing with ownership and being able to talk them off the ledge when things look bad, being able to convince them to take a little bit more risk, maybe when they don't want to sometimes, all those sorts of things. Being able to work well with your head coach, being able to have tight lips, loose lips sink ships. That happens a lot when it comes to coaches and GMs working against each other eventually when times are tough, being able to maintain that loyalty when that happens. Those are all attributes that we don't see that as when someone's a scout. We don't know. I mean, maybe these guys are like, leaking things to reporters and stuff, but they don't have a lot of power to really leak anything for anyone to care about. Those are the attributes we want to see. So, hopefully for the Jets, as they're looking on here, there's going to be some retread types of names that will come up as potentially being the next GM. I like going with younger guys in particular here, just because I think there is more of a way to improve by embracing new ideas when it comes to being a GM than I think that there even is for being a head coach. I think coaching is like, all the accumulated knowledge that's come from coaching over time is pretty well. You get a lot of feedback in coaching. You get a play-by-play feedback. You get game-by-game feedback. You get a lot of different players you've worked with. You get a lot of like feedback and refinement and knowledge that you're getting there. Sure, some of the big macro things can be off when we talk about, run rate. Should it be 65% or 60%, or how they should be approaching things? Do we need, stop the run? Obviously, that was a big problem that the NFL's kind of fixed to a degree there. So there are issues in coaching. Don't get me wrong. There are issues. We're getting a lot better feedback there. As far as being a GM, I don't know what feedback. I mean, you're getting these draft picks, which are just dart throws all the time. You're getting free agency pickups, which are mostly bad. Like, not spending too much free agency is better than spending it. And you're also getting the media, who in the moment is always praising these GMs for trading up to get people, or praising these GMs for making big free agent signing, or praising these GMs like Howie Roseman for picking the players who fell the most versus their draft boards, despite the fact that there's no evidence that those guys actually perform better than where they are eventually drafted. And then you have people hiring them when it comes to ownership directly, who's hiring them, where I don't know. I mean, what are you basing on? Basically just how well they interview most of the time. So it's gonna be really tough. It'll be it'll be interesting to see what happens. There's just a ton of talent out there who are undiscovered and unknown, who have come from good organizations that could probably jump in there and kind of really build something. You're also kind of building something novel, something new. When we're talking about a GM, if you're going to build the right structure with scouting, data analysis, integrating that together, building an analytics structure that works there. This is all, new stuff, right? When it comes to coaching, you got your head coach, you got your offensive coordinator, you got your defensive coordinator, you got your special teams coordinator, you got other, coaches, that position groups, things like that. Like, it's all set in stone. I don't think we're not reinventing the wheel there. It's a lot of wheel reinvention that's going on when it comes to being a GM. And those are the things that I'd like to see. Unfortunately, when ownership is the one making the decisions, or these groups of dinosaur old football guys that they bring in as consultants are making these decisions, you're probably not necessarily finding the right people there. Woody, if you need some consultation, go ahead, get on here. You give me a shout out. I'll help you figure out who's going to take the job, because Lord knows I don't want it. All right, let's let's go through some commentary here, and before we get over to power rankings and who's mad at me. Lots of people, Steelers fans. Shout out to Steelers fans, they're mad at me. Let's go here. What's the commentary here? Okay. This is from Jay here. It says, I like the Steelers model right now. You've got Omar making the strategic plan, then Andy Wield, who's Mr. Super Scout picking personnel. Yeah, I mean, I think those things have to be clearly separated in a way, but the ultimate decider has to be the non-scout guy. And maybe that's what they have going on there with the Steelers. I don't know. I also think the Steelers have a strategic advantage, and they sound like they have an ownership that's not very involved, which, maybe under the wrong regime, that's a bad thing. Maybe it's good to have an overarching ownership, like, I don't know, you could say Jeff Lurie in a way has been a driving force in having an analytical focus on what's going on with Philadelphia. But I think it's good to be a little bit more hands-offish probably from ownership, because again, it's like being a financial advisor. It's like being, if you're, the old stockbroker, well, now you'd call them like a financial advisor or financial planner or something like that. Your number one value as a financial planner is to make sure your clients don't sell when things are tanking, and don't want to buy every stock that's gone up the most recently. Because other people are going to present them, going to go, look, if you would have been invested in, NVIDIA the last 5 years, look how much money you have. And then they'll look and say, why the hell wasn't I invested in NVIDIA? I need to do that going forward. well, you know what? What's happening going forward may not be the same thing as what happened in the past. So it's having that type of person when you don't even have to deal with that as much. When you don't have to deal with the ownership as much, and you might think that like ownership should be the principal and the principal agent issue here. They should have a larger strategic advantage. The reality is like the fans are kind of more the principals rather than even ownership, because ownership can't, there's too many cocktail parties going on where they're talking to each other and they're like, we're losing again, and there's too much noise going out there for them. So maybe having ownership that kind of does nothing, muzzling themselves, is a good way of going about things. And quite honestly, also, if you're a GM, creating systems where you have less power is one way to go. I mean, I say this a lot, that my instincts when it comes to being a GM or to make moves all the time go against, it's not even instincts, I shouldn't say. It's like gut. Go against what maybe a model would say, a pure value calculation would say, this and that. Most of the time, that model's correct and I'm wrong, right? More often than not. Sometimes I could be right. But again, it's flipping a weighted coin in these situations. So you want to even have systems in place to mitigate your own power, or have a committee of people, right? If you don't have it all on the head of one person, maybe that's part of the GM problem here. But I guess the buck has to stop somewhere, right? But empowering some other people below you to also help in that decision-making process. I think that becomes really hard when we're talking about the super scout being in there. It's really hard for the super scout to say, I'm going to defer to the consensus, or I'm going to defer to what these kind of bloodless valuations tell me versus what I feel in my gut. It becomes really, really hard there. And that's something to recognize, and maybe a down point to hiring the super scout. Even though there's another comment here from Kieran, even though Kwesi has been pretty great at free agency, I'm actually somewhat worried about his drafting turning out like Douglas's so far. Yeah, I don't know. It's been an interesting role. It's been an interesting ride with Kwesi, because I feel like some of the trading up, I'm not exactly a huge fan of. But man, things are hitting right now. I think they're up to 5th in my power rankings, which I'll talk about pretty soon. But it's interesting here. All right, let's move on to the power rankings. So just finish it up. RIP Jets. And how we might want to think about the NFL going forward. So for those of you who aren't subscribed to the Substack, get in there. Week 12 power rankings. I put that out about as early as possible, Tuesday mornings. Quick note on methodology here. I mean, one way to think about it, and I'll pull up the this main chart here. So I have my adjusted scores, and Steelers fans are not good on the adjusted scores. For those of you who don't know, yesterday I put out a tweet where I said, according to my adjusted scores, I knew people hate this so much, and that's why I had to do it. I've been around this rodeo a few times before too. People are acting like as if I was surprised by the reaction. No, I knew this reaction was coming. I was actually surprised there wasn't as much of a reaction right at the beginning. But anyway, so I put something out where I said 3 out of the last 4 games, according to my adjusted scores, again, where I downweight some of these high variance aspects of play, fumble recovery luck, other sorts of turnovers, 3rd or 4th down conversions, special teams, penalties, all this sort of stuff. Overweighting success rate versus the outlier plays that feed into EPA. According to those numbers, those adjusted numbers, the Steelers would have lost 3 out of their last 4 games versus being 4-0 since Russell Wilson has been there. Guess what? Steelers fans do not appreciate that. Steelers fans they're in the mode of nobody believes in us. And you're right, nobody believes in you. So at least I appreciate that. I appreciate like nobody believes in us when it's actually true. There was nothing worse than the Patriots. No one believes in us when it's like, you guys are the number 1 seed going into the playoffs, and we got to hear about how no one believes in you. So yeah, no one does believe in you, Steelers fans. So you got that right. Okay. I mean, there's always varying degrees. Nothing's binary. You don't have a 0% chance of winning the title. But even with your record being what it is, Actually, let me bring this up here. Let's figure out what's the Steelers betting odds right now to win the Super Bowl. Let's see. So the Steelers, I'm scanning here. They're not that bad. Plus 1,800. So if those of you, we're going to convert that. I can't do it in my head. I apologize. I know as a math nerd, I should be able to come up with something a little bit quicker, but I can't. So it's about a 5% chance to win. So 1 out of 20, if you want to translate that into another way of looking at it. So about a 5% chance to win. So we have the Lions at plus 320, Chiefs next, Bills, Eagles, Ravens, then Steelers. Now, if I was a Steelers fan, I'd be like, oh, how can the Ravens be higher? They have a worse record, and the Steelers just beat the Ravens. Next, after that, Vikings, Packers, Niners, Chargers. So the Steelers are looking pretty good. But of course, built into that is the fact that they're sitting pretty right now in terms of wins and losses, right? Like you can't separate, you can't look at the Super Bowl odds and say, oh, well, the Steelers are 6th in Super Bowl odds, so therefore they are the 6th best team in the NFL. It's like, well, no, they're 8-2. So that matters a lot, having that record right now, because it's feeding into going to the playoffs. If you look at my numbers overall, when I'm looking at how to calculate these teams by adjusted defensive EPA per play, adjusted offensive EPA per play, they're a slightly below average offense. It hasn't really changed much since Russell Wilson's been in there versus Justin Fields. It's about been the same. So again, this like 4-0 with Russell Wilson. It's more like, I don't know, it happened. Russell Wilson's not really driving necessarily anything. I mean, I guess if you're looking at this like, metaphysical sort of way, yes, Russell Wilson being there, making the exact plays that he's made has led to these victories, I guess. But, not that great. But they do have a pretty good defense in a cluster of a handful of teams that are maybe second-tier defenses after the Minnesota Vikings, looking at what I'm looking at here. But overall, where they stand is not really in the first tier of top teams, not really in the second tier of teams, but kind of in a thickish sort of third tier of teams. And more Steelers fans, I think, are mad at me because I have them 14th in my 13th in my power rankings. But guess what? They're 14th if you go to Unpredictable, which uses kind of some linear algebra and the next 2 weeks of betting spreads to figure out how good teams are vis-a-vis each other. I think they're 14th at that point. So, hey, I'm high on them. Versus some others. But if you look at these different numbers, and as I have them up right now, the Lions are starting to separate a bit more from the rest of the NFL versus what we've seen prior this season. I mean, not a ton, right? According to my numbers, the Bills are pretty close. The Ravens are also pretty close, but that was a rough one for the Ravens this last week. They lost some of their offensive delta over the Lions. The Vikings are actually not that far away, but the Lions have separated a bit here because not only do they have the second best offense, according to my numbers, but they have an above average defense. And offense drives things way more than defense, but it looks decent there. If you look at other shakeups that we've had here in this kind of second tier-ish sort of teams, and we have San Francisco starting to float to the bottom. Many people are very mad at San Francisco being as high as they are. Well, they've blown, I think, 3 or 4 games this year where they had a 90-plus win probability and just hadn't made the plays to make it happen. So they're starting to fall a bit. And the Eagles have risen up. So the Eagles have risen up. San Francisco's moved down. Washington has moved down, but I kind of expected that to happen. As much as I love Jaden Daniels, you're just not going to see a quarterback really finish as the best overall as a rookie. Dan Marino's rookie season may be the closest thing that we've seen to that almost happening. I mean, actually, let me look it up to make sure. Because, Dan Marino had this absolutely insane second season, right? Probably the best season by a quarterback in NFL history. I think it was, according to my numbers that I put together. But even as a rookie, now he only started 7 games as a rookie. But he was pretty good. He's pretty good as a rookie. His his adjusted net yards per attempt actually led the NFL as a rookie. He was third in MVP voting, really, even though he only started 9 games. That's crazy. He was third in Offensive Player of the Year. Somehow he was second in Offensive Rookie of the Year. Who the hell won Offensive Rookie of the Year that year? If it wasn't the guy who was third in MVP. Oh, Eric Dickerson. Oh, no. Let's roll here. I might be looking at the wrong thing. Oh, no, it was Eric Dickerson. So Eric Dickerson with 1,800 rushing yards. Wow. Ended up being higher than Dan Marino that year. So, like, Dan Marino is really the guy. Again, in a shortened season, so if you extend that over a whole season, he probably wouldn't maintain that. But look, as a rookie, Dan Marino led the NFL in adjusted net yards per attempt. He had the lowest sack rate in the NFL as a rookie. Again, sacks are quarterback stats. He had the lowest sack rate in the NFL for his first 7 years straight. Sacks are a quarterback stat once again. And then, of course, he had that incredible, ridiculous, insane-o 1984 season after that. But, like, you know, Daniels is probably not gonna continue on the level that he had been so far this season. So I continue to see them weakening and falling out a bit. But the question is kind of in this next thicker tier, like, who could emerge here? Well, the Chargers are an option. Offensively, they haven't been that good, so they've been a little bit below average, I guess. But the defense has been the second best defense according to my numbers, so that would be a team to watch. If you know, you can get more of first half Justin Herbert from what we saw last game versus second half Justin Herbert, where the first half all the Herbert truthers were out there, you know, waving their flags, planting them, calling themselves the geniuses, and then they kind of forgot the fact that the whole thing almost went to shit in the second half. I have the Bengals being pretty much just as good, if not slightly better. I think I'm slightly better by the final power rankings this year, but making the playoffs is going to be the problem for them. And then beyond that, I don't know. I mean, maybe the Texans can get a little something going. Maybe the Steelers, as we talked about before, can get a little something going. But the Steelers have a major advantage over some of these other teams because they will be pretty solidified to make the playoffs. And that's what's going to be important in here. All right, let me take some questions and then we can get back if anyone has more stuff on the power rankings. I can discuss that a little bit more. Let's talk Steelers first. Okay, the Steelers plus 71 in point differential is pretty impressive compared to the last few seasons. They're almost last in the league in red zone percentage, which should positively regress. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. They've been making all their field goals too. So that's been helpful versus, you know, the Justin Tucker. We're seeing the GOAT. We're seeing Michael Jordan turn to Wizards Michael Jordan here when Justin Tucker's going out there and kicking field goals now. So yeah, no. I mean, they're like a good team, right? It's just, are they 8-2 good? No. Are they 8-2 good? No. They're probably, you know, somewhere between 5-4 and 6 and, I guess that doesn't even work math wise. Somewhere between, you know, like 6-4 ish, sort of good, or maybe close to 5-5 ish. Somewhere between those two, I would say. And their point differential has been good. You know, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, when we talk about, and remember, I remember this starting the season when I was looking at like how long will Russell Wilson be the starter before he potentially gets replaced by Justin Fields. This is before we knew about the Russell Wilson injury and the fact that he wouldn't start, all that stuff. You looked at their schedule to start the season and you said, you know, it doesn't look that bad. I mean, you had the Falcons, so they're okay, right? You had the Broncos back when Bo Nix was not a functional player at that point in time. Still only scored 13 points, so it was really just the defense putting the smack down. The Chargers, Chargers are okay, right? But only scored 10 points. So that defense is really doing some work here. Losing to the Colts and Anthony Richardson, who can, at that point, barely completing passes. Losing to the Cowboys. What we know about the Cowboys now, not great. The Raiders next, the Jets after that. And the Jets is starting with one of the games that I had them as actually being slightly worse, despite the fact that they won the game by 22 points on the scoreboard. So that just shows you how things went a little bit crazy, they actually were converting some of these longer touchdowns. Now, like the Jets are having trouble with the short red zone stuff, but they've also been getting some touchdowns from further out, which are, there's some luck to be flowing back and forth there. Then you have the Giants. Then you have a 1-point win over the Commanders and a 2-point win over the Ravens. Good teams, but, not the greatest. So like the strength of schedule so far. And again, if we bring up in predictable for this and we try to figure out, okay, how's the strength of schedule looked for the Steelers so far? So they've had the 23rd ranked strength of schedule going backwards, where 32 is the easiest schedule and 1 is the toughest schedule. So they had a pretty easy schedule, a bottom 10 difficulty in schedule. And then they have the 6th hardest schedule going forward. And that includes, Cleveland in there twice. But their other games, Cincinnati twice, Baltimore again, Philly in there, and Kansas City. So, Steelers, if you continue this out for the rest of the season, you finish as, the number 2 seed where you are right now, or the number 3 seed, really high up there. The old tip of the cap will happen to you if you do that. I'll give you credit for that if it ends up happening. Gonna wait and see, though. Gonna do a little bit of wait and see on there. Russell Wilson went from having, I think it was like a top 6 sort of EPA per play in the first 3 games that he had been there, and then he kind of, shit the bed against the bad Baltimore Ravens defense so far this year and dropped down into the middle of the league. But hey, that defense is legit so far, but I'm never quite as confident on how defenses will play going forward than others. Here we go. It says Wizards MJ was still better than most NBA players. Was he? I'd have to look into that. He still scored, I guess. And, I'm saying the Steelers are still better than most NFL teams. Just not, top 5 team or something like that. I like to see the most ridiculous power rankings. There's probably some teams who have them as absolutely insane power rankings so far this year. Another question here from Rad Milk. Rad Milk. Is that like radical milk? Are you raw milk? Is this a raw milk enthusiast? Any really positive trends in what we've seen from Drake May that project well going forward? Let me dig into the numbers on this. I think what you can say is that he looks functional so far. And that may not seem like a ringing endorsement, but I'm not going to go as far as some people who will try and put too much on the surrounding situation. But it does matter. I mean, there's no theoretical argument from which you can say that he's had like an easy situation so far this year, right? If we bring up his EPA numbers, let me do this here. So if we're going to take players who have at least 150 dropbacks so far this year, which I believe May falls into it. I mean, he's got positive EPA, but he's still 25th out of 36 players who've had 150 dropbacks so far this year. Maybe actually, you know what? Let me move this up to 200 dropbacks just to narrow it a bit, so I don't have to include like guys who haven't played. Although Deshaun Watson had 271 dropbacks, he's still got more dropbacks than Drake May this season. So 22nd amongst the 29 players in EPA per play. CPOE -2%. Not great, but I think that's okay for a rookie. Completion percentage is definitely something that you see make a big jump from year 1 to year 2. That's why it was weird that Josh Allen had it not between year 1 and year 2, but between year 2 and year 3, along with the other weird stuff with Josh Allen. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that at -2%. I mean, most guys are higher, obviously, but it's something. I think the 8-yard ADOT that he's had so far this year is a little bit on the high side. I like that. He's not just checking down. If we talk about potential going forward, I think that's interesting there. And if we're going to talk about like negatives, so how much do negatives coming into play versus your performance being driven by like low upside that you're just not accumulating that much in terms of straight pass EPA per play? When we look at May, I just want to make sure I'm looking at this correctly. INT is 23. He actually has a lot of fumble. So I think fumble is something that can be cleaned up. So that's good. Obviously, fumble recoveries are fairly random. He's in the top 5 of negative EPA via fumble. So, I mean, like you don't like to see that, right? But he's actually been pretty good at sack avoidance. So the fact that the fumbles are higher, I think, is not that much of a leading indicator. His interceptions are a little bit on the high side. So the fact that he has interceptions and fumbles a little bit on the high side, and then if you look at pass EPA, I mean, not great. He still is not generating a ton of value when he's not turning the ball over or getting sacked. Um, I don't know. I think overall, I know I've kind of just been rambling a bit here. I think overall, nothing that you'd be especially positive on, but he's checking all the marks for saying, okay, the guy looks like he has functional athleticism. The guy looks like he's not too inaccurate. He looks like he has sack avoidance, which is one of the stickier attributes going forward. And he's had some fumble luck that's been bad, that's holding down his numbers a bit. I mean, you'd like to see him get a little bit better before the end of the season, but I don't think it's a I think it's fine. I think he's hitting the marks for what you want to see so far this year. Probably looking better. I don't know if I would put him above Caleb Williams at this point, but it's pretty close. Like again, I'm quick to move on these guys when they're ranked 1, 2, 3 going into the NFL. Everyone yelled at me for saying I'd rather have Jaden Daniels than Caleb Williams, just if you had to pick after 3 weeks into the NFL season, where I think most people obviously agree with that at this point. But that was seen as being the stupidest thing that ever happened. Oh, Herbert got injured in the Steelers game too. Yeah, that's a good point. But they scored some points in that one, so it was good. We got Josh Palmer here. Hey, did you know the Eagles actually lost to the Commanders because I took away all the Eagles points? Yeah. Very, very funny. I know. I do think it's pretty good though. Like the jokes are funny, like the adjusted scores jokes where they're like, "Oh, well, who's going to win the adjusted Super Bowl? You know, I won the adjusted this or the adjusted." I think those are kind of funny. I'll give you some credit there. How come there's Josh Palmer and Joshua Palmer? How many guys? Okay. How much variation is there in rushing success rate and rushing EPA? What would be a leading indicator that a team is on the upswing? I don't know for sure, but I do think if you had success rate, that would be more of a leading indicator. If you had like a good success rate, but a poor rushing EPA, the problem is there is some of this going into it. There's some of this that is the explosiveness that you have at running back, whether or not you're able to juice your EPA through those explosive plays. So if you don't have that, you're going to typically have poor numbers when it comes to EPA versus success rate. And that's going to be something that's sticky. So, we don't want to read too much into any particular team and assume too much. But it's possible. Now, let me see. Let me get this going here so we can. Okay, let's look at offense. Let's see. Let me point out some teams here. So if we're going to look and we're going to say, okay, let's bring up teams where they might have a good success rate running the ball so far this year, but not a great EPA so far. So run success rate versus EPA percentile, run EPA percentile. Let's look at it. Okay, so number one team in success rate has been the Kansas City Chiefs, but they're only ranked right on the outside of the top 10 in EPA running the ball. Well, Kareem Hunt, maybe you're not going to get a ton of juice there on some of those run plays, but at least there's some availability there to potentially make some plays. Another team, fourth in run success rate so far this year is the Atlanta Falcons, but they're only mid-tier when it comes to run EPA here. Now, some of that might be fumbles. I got to look to see. Do I exclude fumbles from this or not? I don't think I do. So, like, fumbles can impact things dramatically when it comes to running the ball. But the Falcons would be a team, and I think if we look at Bijan Robinson, obviously there, I think there's some upside. There's some juice there that we could see them start to turn around. Another team, okay, so tied for ninth in run success rate, who is one in the bottom half of the league, are the Rams. Okay, maybe you can get something going there. And if we're going to look at the flip side, so teams that have poor run success rate, but then high EPA, I think these are, I'd be kind of in a way would be, see this as being somewhat asymmetrical. Like I would be more concerned about teams that have the bad success rate, but good EPA, that potentially regressing going forward. So, okay. So teams that have done well, there is a pretty decent correlation here between the two. Okay. So one team, so 23rd in run success rate, but in the top 12 for EPA per play, Jacksonville Jaguars. Okay, well, you're already sorry. I scrolled that. I did look to see who it was. I mean, things can't get much worse for the Jacksonville Jaguars, so I guess we don't need to talk about them regressing here. 21st in success rate, so a little bit on the negative side, but on the positive side for EPA per play, Green Bay Packers. That's an interesting one. Josh Jacobs, will he be the guy to maintain the strong EPA there versus what they've seen success rate? Maybe. I will say the Packers, my Packers rankings have kind of been all over the place a little bit because it's been difficult to assess with the great offensive success that they had when Jordan Love was out. It was just weird, maybe Matt LaFleur is the greatest coach ever and he can get MVP numbers out of Malik Willis, but it just seems weird. Seems very, very weird. Okay, so one team that's middle of the NFL in success rate, but is near the bottom, is right at the bottom, is second worst in second worst in EPA right now is the Miami Dolphins. So that's a really interesting one because remember how the Miami Dolphins were able to generate these huge runs over the last couple of years? And that's a team. Again, I like Miami a lot more than others. If you look at power rankings right now, I'll bring this back up. If you look at power rankings right now, the Miami Dolphins haven't been good this year, but again, remember they didn't have Tua for all that time. So if you go down a bit further here, I have them at 9th. Now, there's not a lot separating them from teams that are a bit further down, but the reason I have them so high is that, they've done well with Tua. Not only did they done well with Tua this year, but they did well with Tua last year, and they did well with Tua the year before that. So once you start to have, once you're accumulating good performance for a few seasons with a particular quarterback, even if things fall apart at the end of the season and in the playoffs, or at least they have in previous seasons, you can't ignore that. And they've had like a decent defense. Their defense so far this year is league average, which hadn't been the case in previous years. So they also look like they have a success rate based running game that hasn't performed as well as you would think. And that could be an interesting thing to turn around for the Miami Dolphins. All right, I'll take a couple more questions here and then I'll bounce out. Okay, not sure if you discussed this or not, but what is your opinion on what the Jets should do next year at quarterback? Well, okay. I talked about this a little bit, but there's sunk cost fallacy. I saw the worst usage of sunk cost fallacy the other day where it was like you invested a whole lot in something and they called it sunk cost fallacy, even though it was like still a generating asset. So it didn't really, but anyway, so this is more the true sunk cost fallacy. So let's bring up this old Aaron Rodgers contract, just so I know what I'm talking about, at least slightly. And just remember when we're doing this, we always bring up Over the Cap. Don't bring up that other site. Jason Fitzgerald. Over the Cap. Okay, so Aaron Rodgers. There's probably some tricky stuff going on in here, so I can't figure anything out. But so 2025, they have a bunch of void years after that. So if you cut him pre-June 1st, according to the numbers here that we have, it's not only not a cap savings, but it's a $25.5 million additional cap. It's a $49 million dead money hit with a cap number of only 23 million next year because you have all this stuff rolled up into void years. You have $63 million rolled up into void years of cap, it looks like, I guess. So it would have to be, if you're gonna even think about cutting him, you'd have to designate it as a post June 1st, and then you'd save $9.5 million. Well, the way the NFL is going, and this wasn't the case in the past, so these sunk costs and dead money and all that sort of stuff. Nowadays, well, gotta get rid of this. Nowadays, if you have any cap savings at all, even if it's monster dead money, a lot of these teams are willing to just go ahead and take that and say, fine, I'll do it. I'll take all the dead money as long as we're saving something on the cap. I'll just roll with a cheap quarterback and try to figure out what's going on. Maybe. But the problem is, if it's Aaron Rodgers, if you already staked so much on it, if he says he wants to come back, if he looks halfway decent the rest of the year, I think that's going to be a really big factor. Just don't, under any circumstance, get caught into a situation where you think you need to keep him or restructure him beyond just really cutting bait at the end of 2025 at the worst. And be open to drafting a quarterback with your first round pick, or trading up to draft a quarterback with your first round pick. Although, the way things are going now, you don't need to trade up that far to get one of the top players potentially there. Just don't take anything off of the table. And maybe it would be, poor news cycle to draft a quarterback in the first round, and then Aaron Rodgers is grumpy, and then this and that. But then again, maybe you can get a little bit of a boost of, you motivated Aaron Rodgers to be MVP, just like the Jordan Love pick motivated him to come back in his career there. So I don't know. Is there enough to say for sure get rid of him? I'm not sure. There's supposedly had enough talent on the roster to be good this year. So I think if you get some, the right coaching, you build, you don't go overzealous, you build around in the right way, maybe you can roll him out there for one more year. But again, get your contingency plans ready at quarterback for what you're going to do. That's probably where I stand right now. But if you wanted to cut him and spread it out over 2 years, that cap hit, what the hell? I'm not against it, but we are talking about a $50 million cap hit. But nowadays in the NFL, I guess teams are willing to take that sort of stuff. So I could go either way, but just don't get tied into some sort of restructure. Just be ready to get out of there and be ready to draft and figure out what to do next at quarterback. That would be my number one thing. Okay, I don't see a whole lot else in the questions here. I appreciate everyone tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. Got any more questions for me? Go ahead and follow me on Twitter at Kevin Cole _. You can yell at me if you're a Steelers fan. Otherwise, go to the site here, unexpectedpoints.com, to get all the different research. Not only are you going to get the power rankings that I have up, and then you can look at it from previous weeks. The next couple of days, we're going to have the adjusted quarterback efficiency. For those of you who haven't seen that, it goes through what all the different adjustments for different quarterbacks so far this year. I think Jackson's still going to have a pretty healthy lead on Josh Allen, because Josh Allen has these big yak adjustments, but it's not just the yak adjustment. He's had some fumble luck. He's had some INT luck. He's had some good pass protection, and he's had a pretty weak strength of schedule so far for Allen. So Jackson will probably be still number one there, despite the fact that the chorus is building for Allen at MVP. I think Allen kind of deserves MVP from a career standpoint for what he's done. I got the quarterback rankings coming out, Bayesian quarterback rankings based upon adjusted EPA in a methodical sort of way there. And then, of course, the game reviews. For any of you guys who haven't seen the game reviews, every game, not only the adjusted scores and all the different metrics that go into that, but the biggest impact plays by EPA and by win probability, the quarterback numbers broken down by different functions like pass, negatives, interceptions, sacks, rushing, everything that you can piece through that, CPOE, completion percentage over expected, all that sort of stuff. And then also my commentary for each game, which will get into fourth downs and get into other stuff too, some of the nerd shit that people like to see. Anyway, thanks everybody. I'll be coming at you again on this platform, on this live stream next week. Until then, enjoy the rest of the week and enjoy your week 12 of NFL football. Thanks, guys.